Tonight we wander into the warm flicker of candlelight, where the smell of oil, chalk dust, and something oddly breakfast-like fills the air. You squint through the haze and realize, someone's been cracking eggs, but not for a meal. They are stirring yolks into pigments, whisking art into being. The year hovers somewhere around 1400, give or take a few plagues, and you, somehow, have ended up in an artist's workshop at the dawn of the Renaissance. It's messy, miraculous, and faintly sticky. You're about to learn why the same ingredient that turns up in a morning omelette once held together the most divine faces of angels. And yes, you probably won't survive the fumes, figuratively, of course. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle closer to a table crowded with cracked shells. A bowl of golden yolks gleams beside heaps of colored dust, azurite, vermilion, malachite, lapis lazuli ground into velvet powders. The air trembles with the quiet rhythm of apprentices grinding pigment on stone slabs. You reach out, fascinated, as one of them drops a spoonful of yolk into the mix and stares until it gleams like liquid light. You've just witnessed the Renaissance equivalent of Photoshop, egg tempera. You can almost hear the whispered complaints of the medieval past fading away. For centuries before this, art had been mostly about churches, stiff saints, and frescoes painted on damp plaster walls. Tempera existed, sure, but now it's blooming again. Finer brushes, brighter hues, human faces that actually have emotions. The old world's grey cloak begins to tear open, and color pours out, one yolk at a time. If you listen carefully, you can catch a different rhythm underneath the scraping tools, the rhythm of ambition. Europe's waking up after the long medieval nap. Cities like Florence, Siena, and Venice hum with trade, wealth, and a dangerous hunger for beauty. Artists, no longer mere craftsmen tucked under a church's wing, are starting to think of themselves as creators, even geniuses. And genius, it turns out, requires both inspiration and a good breakfast ingredient. You trail your fingers along a painted panel half finished, the Virgin's robe, blue as the sky before dawn, soft under layers of yolk and pigment. That blue, ultramarine, costs more than gold, mined from Afghan lapis and brought across continents by merchants with strong legs and weak patience. Yet the yolk, simple and local, is what binds it to wood. Without it, the color would dust away like forgotten dreams. It's funny, this glowing technique relies on something as perishable as an egg. But there's logic behind the madness. The yolk's natural proteins dry quickly, creating a tough, almost enamel-like film. It keeps color vivid for centuries if you treat it kindly. The irony, of course, is that while the artists worried about eternal salvation, they also stumbled onto eternal preservation. Their angels would outlast them by hundreds of years, their gold halos still radiant under modern museum lights. As you watch, a master strides in, robe swishing like a sermon. He sniffs the air, nods approvingly, and corrects a trembling apprentice's brushstroke with the ease of someone who's painted enough saints to start doubting sainthood itself. Too much yolk, he murmurs in Italian that sounds like honey poured over stone. Not enough pigment. The apprentice blushes. You can tell that tomorrow's breakfast ration just vanished into that bowl. Historians still argue whether tempera's dominance came from artistic preference or simple practicality. Some claim it was about control, egg dries fast, forcing discipline, precision, a kind of holy patience. Others insist it was just what they had, eggs were cheap, oils were rare, and alchemy hadn't yet worked out how to make paint stay flexible. You nod along, realizing that art history is, at heart, a series of glorified kitchen experiments. Then there's a stranger fact. Some monks used to bless the eggs before cracking them, muttering prayers to ward off rot. The logic? If you're painting God, you might as well keep the ingredients pure. That's a far cry from how you fry one up after a hangover. But hey, context matters. You notice the faint sour scent of drying yolk, a little metallic, a little like forgotten laundry. One apprentice jokes that the paint smells of salvation, another whispers that it smells like doom. You almost laugh, because even centuries later, the smell lingers in preserved tempera works. Imagine that, divine light mixed with armlet breath. The master begins a lecture about color's morality. Blue, he says, belongs to the Virgin. Red is for blood and sacrifice. Gold is heaven itself. You realize each egg is cracked not just for chemistry but theology. Every yolk binds belief to brush. You can almost see the pigment shimmer in rhythm with the man's heartbeat. Then there's an accident. An apprentice trips, a bowl of yolk splatters across the floor, bright as spilled sunlight. Groans echo through the studio. You instinctively step back, remembering the modern nightmare of dropping your coffee on a laptop. The master sighs, muttering, "At least it wasn't ultramarine." Everyone nods solemnly, because that blue costs more than their collective wages. Your gaze drifts to the window where morning light cuts through the haze, catching on half-finished wings and halos. The effect is unreal. You suddenly understand why Renaissance painters chased luminosity. Light itself felt sacred. An egg yolk, that humble binder, turned ordinary minerals into captured sunlight. You catch yourself smiling. There's a strange poetry in how fragile beauty begins with something you could buy at a market stall. The same yolk that fries in a pan becomes the secret of immortal color. The Renaissance wasn't just a rebirth of knowledge. It was a rediscovery of how to make things shine. By now, your feet ache from standing on uneven planks, and your nose stings with dust, but you don't move. You're hypnotized by the brush's slow strokes, by how the paint glides, never gloopy, never dull. You think about modern tubes of acrylic and realize these artists mixed everything fresh, every day. No preservatives, no shortcuts. Just patience, precision, and maybe a prayer that no one sneezed into the pigment. The night drifts onward. The candle flames burn lower, the yolks dry, and the panels gleam under the soft hum of devotion. You realize this isn't just about art, it's about control over time. Each layer of paint, each cracked egg, is a tiny rebellion against decay. And somewhere deep down, you suspect that's what every artist really wants. A way to stop the rot, to stretch a moment of light forever. As the studio fades around you, your fingers still feel tacky with imaginary yolk. You're not sure if that's art or breakfast residue, but you know one thing, the Renaissance painters weren't hoarding eggs because they loved brunch. They were hoarding light. The candlelight softens into morning, and you find yourself still in the workshop, though now it smells less like divinity and more like a kitchen that forgot to open a window. You can hear chickens clucking somewhere outside, small, irritable suppliers of the most vital art material of the age. You step closer to the long wooden table and realize the whole place is an organized chaos. Jars of crushed stone, little piles of chalk, and mortars sticky with leftover pigment. It's not a studio, it's an alchemical kitchen. You watch as a young apprentice drags a pestle through vermilion dust, his arm moving in a slow, circular rhythm. The master walks behind him, checking the consistency like a baker testing dough. Not too coarse, he warns, and not too fine. The boy nods, sweating, while you try to ignore the tickle of red particles in your nose. You realize the painter's life wasn't glamorous. It was dusty, smelly, and occasionally life-shortening. Those gorgeous reds and greens, often laced with mercury or arsenic. Usher would have had a field day. Historians still argue whether the Renaissance workshop was more laboratory or monastery. You suspect it was both, a place where devotion and experiment met in the same cracked bowl. The apprentices mixed, scraped, and tested endlessly, following recipes as if they were sacred texts. Each jar bore a secret: a pinch of ground glass for brilliance, a splash of vinegar to thin the mix, or the yolk of a particularly happy chicken for extra shine. No one joked about wasting ingredients. Every egg carried the weight of a commission, a promise to a patron, and maybe the faint threat of eternal damnation if the saints didn't look convincing. You can practically taste the tension in the air. The master has just received a visit from a Dominican friar, whispering about an altarpiece due in 3 weeks. The friar leaves behind a pose of florins and a list of theological demands. More angels, fewer exposed ankles, he says on his way out. The master grunts. You stifle a laugh, realizing that Renaissance art direction wasn't so different from modern clients. Everyone had opinions, few had taste, and deadlines always glared like Judgment Day. You lean over a shelf filled with dried brushes and realize something. The real magic happens not in painting but in preparation. Every color is a ritual. The apprentices crack eggs with care, separating yolk from white using their fingers, letting the golden orb roll gently across their palms. You feel a mix of awe and queasiness. One drop of yolk too much, and the paint dries like cracked mud. Too little, and it flakes like pastry. The perfect balance, slippery, luminous, alive, is a skill that takes years to master. Someone in the corner murmurs about an experiment. He's trying to mix yolk with honey, hoping it'll make the paint dry slower. The master shakes his head but lets him try. Only fools and saints make discoveries, he says with a shrug. You can tell which category he thinks his student belongs to. The scent in the room grows richer as pigments mingle. You close your eyes and imagine the colors: the green of crushed malachite, cool and deep; the blue of azurite, sharp as a winter sky; the red of cinnabar, almost glowing with inner fire. These are not mere shades, they are relics of the earth itself. Each particle, bound in yolk, will become a stroke of divine flesh or shimmering robe. You think about how modern paint tubes come ready-made, and for a moment, you feel like you've been cheating all along. A little to your right, another apprentice leans too close to his palette. His hair brushes the paint, leaving a streak of blue across his forehead. No one says a word, they all have similar scars of devotion. The work continues, grinding, stirring, whispering prayers under breath. You realize that for them, art isn't expression, it's transformation. They are not making images, they are conjuring light out of doubt. The master points to a nearby shelf of strange bottles. You notice ingredients that wouldn't look out of place in a witch's kitchen: vinegar, wine, linseed oil, even bits of resin. A few apprentices debate which ingredient gives better shine. One insists that pure yolk creates the most holy light. Another swears by a splash of wine for divine fluidity. Historians still argue whether the painters truly believed in these distinctions or just enjoyed having a reason to drink on the job. You trail the master as he walks toward the wall, where an unfinished panel leans against the plaster. The surface glows faintly in the morning light. He dips a brush into his yolk mixture and drags a fine stroke along the Virgin's cheek. The color is so smooth it looks alive. You realize this isn't paint, it's breath, captured in layers. You whisper to yourself that no digital brush could ever replicate that human patience. In the background, someone hums a hymn. You join in quietly, not because you know the tune but because it feels wrong to break the silence any other way. The rhythm of work continues, soft thuds, murmurs, the faint squeak of brushes on wood. You could fall asleep standing here, lulled by the devotion in every movement. Then comes the moment of chaos. The experiment with honey goes badly, the paint refuses to dry. The apprentice panics, waving his sticky board like a flag of surrender. The master sighs and mutters something about ants liking art too much. You can't help but laugh quietly. Even in history's most hallowed studios, Mistakes smelled like sugar and regret. You notice, too, that everything in this room seems designed to blur the line between art and life. The same knife that trims woodcuts bread, the same cloth that wipes brushes mops sweat. You think about how fragile it all is, how a single careless motion could ruin weeks of work. Maybe that's why the artists clung to ritual, to measured calm, to the promise that if they just mixed one more perfect yolk, the divine might appear. And so, through the haze of color and candle smoke, you begin to see the workshop not just as a workplace but as a world. A world where every egg cracked is an invocation, every brushstroke a prayer, every pigment a borrowed piece of the cosmos. The Renaissance wasn't just rebirth, it was reassembly, a rebuilding of light one yolk at a time. As the day wanes, the master finally sets down his brush. He wipes his hands on a rag already stained a dozen colors and says softly, "Tomorrow, we test the new gold." The apprentices nod, exhausted. You glance once more at the palettes, each one gleaming under the dimming light like small captured suns. You take a slow breath, feeling the air heavy with color and ambition. Maybe the Renaissance wasn't fueled by philosophy or money after all. Maybe it was powered by the humble hope that beauty, properly mixed, might never fade. And if that meant hoarding eggs until every hen in Florence filed a complaint, so be it. The morning haze settles into golden calm, and you find yourself leaning over a slab of marble where someone has been mixing color. The surface gleams with smears of yellow, red, and blue, each streak a whisper from centuries past. The master gestures for you to come closer, and you obey, still not entirely over the fact that you've time-traveled into an art class that smells like brunch. "Watch," he says, holding up a small ceramic bowl. Inside is the yolk of an egg, freshly separated, glowing like liquid sunlight. He pricks the yolk with a pin and lets it slip free, a slow drop of gold into a heap of powdered pigment. He stirs with the tip of a brush, and suddenly, the color deepens, thickens, and comes alive. You watch in fascination. This is the secret of the Renaissance palette. The moment yolk meets pigment, chemistry and mysticism shake hands. It's not just about texture. It's about transformation. You can see the granules dissolve into creamy smoothness, the mixture glinting faintly as the yolk's natural proteins bind each particle together. The master explains in a voice that sounds both bored and reverent. "The yolk dries fast, but not too fast," he says. "It keeps the color bright. It hardens like enamel." You nod, pretending you already knew that, but honestly, it's pure wizardry. Historians still argue whether the painters understood the science behind their success or just trusted the results. Modern conservators say the yolk's lecithin and protein molecules form a tight, water-resistant film, trapping pigments in a luminous skin. But for the Renaissance artist, it wasn't molecules, it was magic. You can't really blame them. After all, you're watching an egg yolk outshine gold leaf. A curious apprentice sneaks beside the master and asks, "Maestro, can I use duck egg?" The master pauses mid-stir, gives him a stare sharp enough to cut marble, and replies, "Only if you wish the virgin to smell like the river." You snort softly. Apparently, the subtleties of poultry mattered as much as theology. The atmosphere shifts into a rhythm: crack, mix, test, repeat. The apprentices grind pigments while humming off-key hymns, occasionally comparing their mixtures like rival bartenders. One swears by adding a drop of vinegar for brightness, another adds wine for softness. You can practically hear the YouTube comment debates forming 5 centuries too early. The master shows you his own mixture, vermilion blended with yolk until it glows like molten sunset. He lifts the brush and drags it across a primed wooden panel. The line dries almost instantly, smooth and even, no streaks. He smiles faintly. "See? The egg gives discipline. No second chances. You realize how different this is from modern paint that lets you layer and correct endlessly. Here, you make one move, then live with it. You can sense the quiet fear of every brushstroke. Each line must be deliberate, each blend must be perfect, because tempera doesn't forgive. The master explains, oil will let you change your mind. Egg never does. You think about that for a moment, how life, too, sometimes feels more yolk than oil. Still, there's an odd satisfaction in it. The quick drying forces clarity. The artist has to know exactly what he wants before he begins. There's no smudging, no blending away mistakes, no hiding behind thickness. Every hue is transparent, glowing with a delicate honesty that even centuries can't dull. A quirky little tidbit. Some painters were rumored to whisper to their egg yolks, literally speak to them, before mixing. For purity, they said, though it might have been for comfort. One Florentine record mentions an artist who claimed his paint spoiled if anyone cursed nearby. You imagine the workshop suddenly going silent every time someone stubbed a toe. The master waves a hand for you to try. You hesitate, but curiosity wins. He pours a bit of yolk into a small pile of ultramarine dust. Yes, the really expensive one, and nods toward the pestle. You grind gently, and immediately the color starts to change, darkening into a velvety richness you've never seen in modern paint. It feels alive under your fingers, almost breathing. You realize that this isn't just mixing, it's communion. Now paint, the master says. You dip the brush and pull a line across the test panel. It glides smoother than you expect, then dries almost instantly into something that looks carved rather than brushed. You touch it lightly, it's already firm. That's the yolk's gift, he says. Speed and permanence. Angels dry faster than sinners. The air fills with the soft sounds of creation. Brushes whispering, eggshells clinking, pigment grinding. You catch yourself smiling again. It's easy to romanticize it now, but you can see the exhaustion in every apprentice's eyes. The mixture must be made fresh every day. It spoils within hours. If it dries too quickly, the day's work is ruined. If it dries too slowly, the master's temper spoils faster than the paint. There's a kind of meditative monotony to it. Crack an egg, separate yolk, piece the sack, mix with pigment, test stroke, adjust. Again. And again. It's the heartbeat of the Renaissance studio. Steady, repetitive, disciplined. You start to think maybe the real art isn't in painting saints at all. It's in surviving the preparation without losing your mind. The master pauses, wiping his hands on his apron, and muses aloud. We trap sunlight in yolk. Can you think of a nobler thing? You shake your head, though part of you wonders how many poor chickens had to give up their mornings for ART's sake. Later, you wander to the back of the room where finished panels rest. You tilt one and see the light catch on the paint's surface. It doesn't just reflect, it seems to glow from within. That's the hallmark of egg tempera. It doesn't coat the wood, it fuses with it. Each layer builds a subtle radiance until even the shadows seem to breathe. And yet, despite all the beauty, there's fragility too. A sudden shift in humidity could crack a masterpiece. Too much heat and the paint might blister. It's a constant dance between control and chaos. Maybe that's why the Renaissance loved tempera so much. It mirrored life. Fleeting, luminous, impossible to fully master. You can't help but notice that the master still hoards his yolks. Every bowl covered, every shell saved. He won't tell anyone his exact ratios. You suspect even the apprentices don't know. Trade secrets, perhaps, or superstition. Historians still argue whether such secrecy was practical or ritual, but you get the feeling it was both. After all, what's genius without a little mystery? As evening draws in, the colors on the wall shift with the light. Golds bone deeper, blues grow cooler. The room feels alive, pulsing softly as if the yolk itself remembers the sun. You lean against the table, exhausted but enchanted, realizing that in this golden glue lies the secret of immortality, one that outlasted its makers, its churches, and probably a few dozen chicken generations. When you finally glance toward the doorway, the master is already covering his pigments, sealing the yolk bowls for the night. Tomorrow, it will all begin again. More eggs, more grinding, more light trapped in tiny strokes. You step back into the dusk, hearing the faint sound of clucking in the courtyard, and you can't help but whisper a quiet thanks to the humble creatures whose breakfast offerings became the Renaissance's brightest miracles. You wake, or rather drift, into the next morning of that same humming workshop, the light sharper now, the smell of drying yolk stronger. The floorboards feel tacky under your shoes, as though centuries of spilled tempera have varnished them into a golden film. The master is already at work, brush poised, and you realize he's muttering to himself, not out of madness, but out of negotiation. Today's challenge: fragility. You watch as he leans close to a panel depicting the Archangel Gabriel, wings radiant yet perilously thin. A crack zigzags through the paint near the halo. The master groans softly, tracing it with a fingertip. The problem with beauty, you realize, is that it always wants to crumble. Egg tempera might glow brighter than oil, but it's brittle. It doesn't bend, it doesn't forgive. It's perfection with a hairline fracture. Historians still argue whether Renaissance painters preferred egg tempera because of its fragility or despite it. Some claim the cracks gave the works an organic, sacred patina, as though time itself had signed the painting. Others think the artists just didn't have better materials yet. Either way, every flake of fallen paint was both a heartbreak and a badge of devotion. The master dips a tiny brush into fresh yolk and begins mending the crack, feathering color along the edges until it nearly vanishes. You lean closer. The fix looks miraculous, but the tension remains. The whole surface is taut like a drum, ready to split again if the weather changes its mind. You glance at the window, sunlight already warming the air, and understand why painters often cursed humidity like sailors cursed storms. Too much moisture, the master mutters. The yolk turns soft. Too dry, it breaks. He shakes his head. Balance, always balance. You watch him lift the panel from the easel and store it in the shade, as though tucking a child into bed. Nearby, the apprentices are preparing new boards. They brush a mix of glue and chalk, called gesso, onto the wood, layer by careful layer. When dry, it will be polished to a smooth, eggshell sheen, ready for painting. The irony doesn't escape you. Even the base looks like an egg before the egg paint ever touches it. You realize that the Renaissance painter was a kind of obsessive perfectionist. Everything, from wood grain to temperature to how long an egg sat before cracking, had to be exact. One apprentice scratches at his arm and mutters, "The gesso itches." Another replies, "Better than mold." They laugh softly, though you can tell the fear's real. Tempera paint might be durable once dry, but before that, it's a living thing, fragile, unpredictable, occasionally foul. If stored too long, the yolk spoils. If mixed with the wrong pigment, it curdles into a smelly paste. You can imagine the workshop's corner as a quiet graveyard of failed experiments. Still, for every disaster, there's wonder. The master gestures toward a panel drying on the shelf. The image seems to float on the surface, transparent layers stacked until light refracts softly through them. The angel's skin looks almost human, and you understand that fragility wasn't a flaw, it was a path to transcendence. The paint's quick drying forced artists to think in glazes, to build thin veils of color. That's why tempera faces have that porcelain serenity. They're literally born from restraint. There's a rumor, one apprentice says, that a painter in Siena tried mixing his yolk with milk to make it softer. Another tried beer. Neither fared well. The saints cracked before the paint did, someone jokes. You grin, imagining the holy figures slowly blistering under experimental enthusiasm. The Renaissance may have been glorious, but it was also messy, equal parts genius and kitchen disaster. You run your finger gently along the edge of a finished frame, feeling the fine powder of gesso under your skin. The master eyes you but says nothing. He's too deep in concentration, repairing another fragile section. You wonder what it must have been like to live in a world where art decayed as fast as it was made. No varnish could save it, no chemical preservation, just the hope that devotion would outlast time. And then the whisper of heresy, oil. The word slides into conversation like a secret sin. One apprentice has heard of northern painters, Flemish, bold, maybe reckless, using oils instead of yolk. Their colors, he says, stay wet longer, allowing blending, correction, softness. The others scoff. Oils are greasy. Vulgar, one mutters. Fit for taverns, not churches. The master pretends not to hear, but his brush trembles slightly, betraying the tiniest insecurity. You notice how everyone's eyes dart toward the jars of yolk as though they might overhear the blasphemy. For centuries, tempera was truth itself, the chosen medium of divinity. Oil, with its slow-drying and sensuous texture, feels suspiciously human. Still, as cracks spread and restorers sigh, you sense the tide beginning to turn. Fragility breeds innovation, after all. Painters crave control over light and time, and the yolk can only grant so much. You can almost feel the coming tension, the old guard clutching their eggs, the young ones reaching for oil flasks. But for now, the studio hums on, defiant against decay. The master experiments quietly, whispering to himself about ways to strengthen the mixture. He adds a drop of vinegar, then a bit of fig sap. The apprentices pretend not to notice. You smile, realizing you're witnessing a scientific mind hiding inside a pious soul. Renaissance alchemy wasn't all about gold, it was also about making egg paint that didn't crack in summer. Outside, the bells of Florence toll. The sound vibrates through the windows, shaking dust motes loose. One of them lands on the drying panel. The master rushes to blow it off, nearly tripping over a stool. Even the air disrespects me, he mutters. You stifle a laugh. For all their heavenly ambitions, these artists fought earthly problems. Flies, dust, humidity, bad eggs. Yet there's something admirable in the struggle. Each crack repaired, each layer polished. It's proof that beauty doesn't exist without fragility. The yolk gives life, but also limits it. Maybe that's why these paintings feel alive. They age, they flake, they breathe like old skin. You think of modern restorers centuries later, peering under microscopes at the same proteins that once made apprentices cry. As the day fades, you stand before the angel panel again. The repaired crack glows faintly in the dim light. You can't even tell where it had been. You feel a pang of awe. This art form demands both control and surrender. Maybe that's the secret charm. The yolk reminds you that nothing perfect stays unbroken for long, but even cracks can gleam if painted with care. The master covers the panels with cloth and sighs. Tomorrow, he says softly, we paint the sky again. You nod, unsure if he's talking to you or to the centuries that will come after. The candles burn low, their light flickering across drying halos. You glance one last time at the yolk bowls, half covered, still golden, and realize the fragile beauty of this art isn't a flaw at all. It's a philosophy, the divine, held together by breakfast and hope. The next day, the sound of hammering echoes from the far end of the workshop. You follow the noise to where a pair of apprentices wrestle a wooden panel into place, their sleeves rolled up, their hair clotted with sawdust. The air smells of pine and glue, earthier, less mystical than yesterday's yolk-scented haze. The master watches closely, his hands clasped behind his back, muttering about warping and humidity and the sins of careless carpenters. You realize today's lesson isn't about mixing, it's about migration. Art is leaving the walls of churches and finding new homes on wood. Once upon a time, the great murals of devotion, those vast, frescoed saints, lived only on plaster, soaking into the walls themselves. Egg tempera couldn't survive there. It dried too fast, demanded too smooth a surface. But on a wooden panel, carefully sanded, sealed with gesso, primed to perfection, the yolk could perform miracles. You can practically see the evolution unfolding, from crumbling church frescoes to portable altarpieces, objects that can travel, be sold, be owned. You think, with a modern smirk, that art has just discovered its first limited edition print. The master gestures for you to come closer. He runs a finger along the panel's surface, testing for flaws. Every saint deserves good wood, he says dryly. Bad grain, bad prayers. You stifle a laugh. It sounds absurd, but there's truth in it. If the surface warps, the paint cracks. If the gesso absorbs too much moisture, the yolk curdles. It's like baking a holy cake. One wrong measurement and you're serving blasphemy. Historians still argue whether the shift to wood panels came from necessity or ambition. Some believe the wealthy patrons of Florence wanted art they could move, hang, and show off like a luxury object. Others think it was purely technical, artists searching for smoother, stronger canvases for their egg tempera masterpieces. Either way, it changed everything. A fresco belonged to the church, a panel could belong to you. You watch as the apprentices stretch thin sheets of linen over the panel, gluing them down with rabbit skin glue, a strange, pungent concoction that fills the room with a scent halfway between broth and varnish. Over that, they spread the gesso in patient, creamy strokes. When it dries, they'll sand it until it shines like marble. You touch the surface, cool, smooth, and faintly dusty. It's oddly satisfying, like brushing against the skin of something waiting to become divine. The master explains that egg tempera loves this kind of surface. She wants it smooth, he says, patting the board affectionately, or she sulks. You smile at his pronoun choice. Painters always talk about tempera as if she's alive, temperamental, demanding, high maintenance. You suppose if paint had a personality, it would definitely be a diva. One apprentice brings out a piece of parchment and begins tracing a faint outline, a saint, perhaps, or a donor with a mildly self-satisfied grin. He pricks holes along the lines, then dusts charcoal through them, transferring the image onto the gesso. You lean close and see the faint pattern forming, dots of destiny. From there, the real painting will begin, yolk by yolk, layer by layer. A stray chicken wanders into the workshop, no joke, and pecks curiously at the wood shavings. Everyone bursts into laughter. The patron herself, one apprentice declares, bowing dramatically. You imagine her indignation if she knew her future descendants would be remembered mostly for their reproductive efficiency. Still, there's something poetic about it. The creature whose gift binds celestial faces strutting through the very space where heaven is painted. The master shoos her away with his apron and mutters something about omens. He's only half joking. Many painters believed certain eggs, those from hens that crowed at dawn, or those laid under a full moon, made better tempera. You can't decide if that's science or superstition, but the image of moonlight charmed armlets makes you grin. Once the outlines are done, color begins. The apprentices work quietly, each focused on a different section of the same altarpiece. You realize these panels are collaborative, dozens of hands, one vision. The master oversees everything, occasionally stepping in to adjust a line or brighten a halo. It's not unlike a modern film set, with him as the director, the apprentices his crew, and the egg yolks his special effects department. The panels themselves gleam like mirrors under the light. You can already see where the yolk has bonded with pigment, giving each color its peculiar, almost sacred sheen. It's different from fresco, less earthy, more celestial. Where fresco sinks into stone, tempera floats above it, like light caught midair. You understand now why the churches fell in love with it. This was heaven made portable. The master wipes his hands, satisfied, and begins to talk about patrons. They want devotion, he says, but they pay for prestige. He points to a small figure kneeling beside the Virgin in one painting. That's him, the banker who ordered it. He'll look up at her forever, pretending it's humility. You grin. Some things never change. As the day drifts on, you wander to the far wall where older panels hang to dry. Time has worked its quiet mischief, fine cracks spider across the surface, but the colors still pulse with life. The yolk has aged beautifully, turning every shadow soft, every highlight eternal. It's humbling to think that these fragile, glowing faces once traveled through candle smoke, floods, wars, and still whisper in gold. A fringe anecdote filters through the chatter. Somewhere in Venice, a painter supposedly mixed yolk tempera with crushed pearls to paint the robes of saints. Too heavy, the master snorts, the paint fell off. Still, you imagine the glint of light it must have given, the shimmer of heaven rendered by shellfish. You sit quietly as the apprentices clean up, wiping brushes and scraping dried gesso from their hands. The panels stand lined against the wall, each one catching the dying sun in a warm, honeyed glow. You realize you're witnessing a revolution in miniature. Art, once fixed to walls, now breathes freely. Portable, personal, infinitely reproducible. The chickens outside squawk again, and you smile at the absurd symmetry of it all. The same creature that laid the golden binder for these holy visions now scolds the apprentices for stealing her future breakfast. You can't decide whether to laugh or bow. The master gives one last look around the studio and says quietly, "The wood will hold the light, if the egg obeys." You think about that for a while, the faith it takes to believe that something so fragile could carry eternity. The yolk, the wood, the hand, they all conspire against decay. And as dusk falls across the room, turning gold into amber, you feel a strange comfort in that fragility. The Renaissance wasn't just about beauty. It was about daring to bind heaven to matter, to trust that even a cracked egg and a plank of wood could hold the infinite for a while. By the time the next dawn slips through the shutters, you've begun to think of yourself as part of the crew. Another sleep-deprived apprentice with yolk-stained fingers and an unpaid internship in eternity. The studio hums like a beehive. No one's painting yet. This is prep hour, the daily grind, literally. You find your spot at the pigment table and take up the pestle. Because today you're learning the secret art of making color from stone. The marble slab before you gleams like cold milk. A small pile of malachite powder rests on its surface, green as envy and twice as expensive. You add a few drops of water, and the paste forms, thick and gritty. The master watches over your shoulder. Slowly, he warns, or you'll bruise the color. You nod obediently and begin to grind in small circles, your arm already aching. The stone sighs under pressure, releasing its hidden hue. Around you, apprentices work in a kind of ritualized chaos. One slicing open eggs, another filtering dust through linen, a third sharpening brushes with a small knife. It's half factory, half monastery, the smell of yolk and sweat hanging in the air. Someone coughs, someone sneezes, someone curses softly when a shell falls into the bowl. You glance at him, he scoops it out and mutters, "Saint Peter forgive me," which probably cancels the profanity. Historians still argue whether apprentices were exploited laborious or blessed disciples. Standing here, elbow deep in egg, you're leaning toward exploited. The hours are brutal, the pay minimal, and yet everyone carries a quiet pride, because every saint's face they help create earns them a tiny brushstroke of immortality. You look around and spot the youngest apprentice, barely 12, struggling with a lump of azurite. His pestle barely moves. The master sighs, takes it from him, and in 2 smooth rotations turns the powder fine as silk. Like this, he says. The boy nods, wide-eyed, and you realize you're watching a centuries-old mentorship ritual, the transfer of skill through sheer muscle memory. A funny thing about these workshops, despite the holy subject matter, they ran on gossip. While grinding, the apprentices trade rumors like market vendors. Did you hear, one says, that Botticelli's apprentice fainted from egg fumes? Another adds, Leonardo mixes with nut oil now, heretic. The master pretends not to hear, but his eyebrow twitches. You can tell he's curious too. In a corner, someone's separating yolks with methodical precision. The trick, you learn, is to roll the yolk gently between your palms, letting the white slip away before piecing the membrane. The result, pure gold liquid, slides into the pigment like honey. The sound is oddly soothing, the soft squelch of creation. You imagine it as the Renaissance version of ASMR. You try it yourself. The yolk trembles in your hand, warm from the chicken's recent contribution. You pierce the skin with a pin and squeeze. The golden stream hits the pigment pile, and for a moment, it looks like sunrise spilling over mountains. The smell isn't great, sour, earthy, but the transformation is mesmerizing. As you stir, you catch snippets of banter. Careful, too much yolk and it cracks. Too little and it turns to dust. Too much prayer and nothing dries. Everyone laughs, a weary, knowing laugh. You realize the workshop's rhythm depends on these tiny jokes, the only defense against monotony. A fringe fact drifts your way. One apprentice swears that rubbing garlic juice onto brushes keeps the paint smoother. Another claims that adding a drop of vinegar prevents mold. The master cuts in sharply. Garlic is for sausages. Vinegar is for sinners. You're not sure whether that's chemistry or theology, but no one argues. Your arm aches from grinding. You look up and see rows of jars filled with colors. Cinnabar, ochre, lapis, lead tin yellow. They glint like treasures, but you know how dangerous some of them are. The red cinnabar, beautiful but toxic, could slowly poison anyone careless enough to lick the brush tip. You shudder, remembering how many old masters died mysteriously of the lungs. Turns out art history's golden glow sometimes came with a cough. The master calls for a break. The apprentices slump against the walls, munching on bread and figures. You join them, careful not to mix crumbs into the pigment. The conversation drifts from gossip to gratitude. Someone got permission to sign a corner of a painting, a rare honor. You can feel the camaraderie here, born of exhaustion and reverence. When work resumes, you're assigned to clean the brushes. They are made of squirrel hair, goat, or hog bristles, bound with twine. The finer ones, for faces and folds, are treasured like relics. You dip them into a bowl of water mixed with lye soap and yolk, swirling gently. The residue clouds the water a faint pastel. It's like watching a day's labor dissolve. One apprentice hums as he works, a song about Saint Luke, patron of painters. He used egg tempera too, he says proudly. The master overhears and smiles faintly. Luke knew the secret, he says. If the yolk dries, the soul stays. You suspect that's not entirely canon, but it's poetic enough to believe. By late afternoon, your back hurts, your hands are sticky, and your mind floats in a hazy blend of fatigue and wonder. You start to understand why these people endured such tedium. Every drop of yolk, every grain of pigment, every carefully ground stone, it all adds up to something that might last centuries. The idea is intoxicating, that boredom and devotion could fuse into beauty. A sudden crash interrupts your thoughts. A jar of ultramarine has rolled off the shelf and shattered on the floor. Everyone freezes. The blue powder spreads like spilled sky, and for a moment, no one breathes. Ultramarine costs more than gold, literally. The master's face turns pale. Then, slowly, he kneels and begins scooping it up with trembling hands. You join him instinctively, and the others follow, all silent. It feels like a funeral for light. When the last of the pigment is saved, he exhales shakily. No one speaks of this, he murmurs, and the apprentices nod. The incident becomes a secret pact. You realize how sacred materials were to these people. Every color had meaning, every drop a price. As evening falls, you step outside for air. The sky itself looks like a fresco, layers of pink, blue, and gold, as if heaven is mocking the artists below. You can hear the distant cluck of chickens again, their mundane song underscoring all this holy labor. You smile at the absurdity. Somewhere between the egg and eternity, humanity managed to paint its soul. When you return to the studio, the master is locking away the remaining yolks. They spoil fast, he says softly, and beauty spoils faster. You know he's not talking about breakfast anymore. You watch him a moment longer, then glance at your own stained hands. Maybe tomorrow you'll get to paint. Or maybe you'll just grind again. Either way, you're part of the chain, fragile, repetitive, golden. The next week dawns quieter, but tension hums beneath the calm like a taut violin string. Rumors have arrived from the north, Flanders, to be exact, and they've shaken even the most confident masters. You overhear it in fragments. Linseed oil, one whispers, they are painting with oil. The word sounds almost scandalous, like a forbidden charm. You can't help but grin. Leave it to artists to panic over salad dressing. Still, there's an undeniable unease in the workshop. The master doesn't say much, but his grinding has grown more aggressive, his pestle striking the stone like a warning bell. He mutters about those slippery Flemish devils, while the apprentices exchange nervous glances. Everyone knows what's at stake. For generations, egg tempera has been the way, pure, luminous, disciplined. Now, a new medium threatens to rewrite the rules of beauty itself. You peek over an apprentice's shoulder as he leafs through a sketchbook filled with rough notes about the northern technique. Slow drying, blendable, glossy finish. He shakes his head. Greasy stuff. How do they even breathe in there? Another replies, maybe that's why their saints look so smug. The laughter that follows is brittle, defensive, almost frightened. Historians still argue whether the rise of oil paint was a revolution or an evolution, whether Jan van Eyck invented it or simply perfected something older. Either way, you can feel the shift in the air, like the scent of rain before a storm. Oil is coming, and yolk is starting to smell like yesterday. The master finally gathers everyone and says what they've all been dreading: we must learn it. His voice is calm, but his jaw tightens. Patrons ask for it. They want shine. They want softness. They want northern things. He says the last words as if they are slightly indecent. You suspect he means realism. You watch as he brings out a small vial of linseed oil, thick, golden, faintly sticky. It gleams in the candlelight like a liquid gem. This, he declares, is what they call progress. He dips a brush, hesitates, then spreads a streak across a scrap of gessoed board. The color flows differently, slower, silkier, obedient. It's beautiful, you admit, but in a lazy sort of way. He frowns. Too easy, he mutters. Tempera demands devotion. Oil just lounges. One apprentice dares to joke. Maybe oil's for sinners who want second chances. The master smirks. Or for painters who can't finish before lunch. Everyone laughs, but the laughter feels like a wall, thin, fragile, painted over fear. You can see why oil tempts them. With tempera, mistakes are permanent. Every stroke dries instantly. With oil, you can blend, change, rethink. It's like moving from carving marble to modeling clay. The shift isn't just technical, it's philosophical. Egg tempera belongs to faith and discipline. Oil belongs to emotion and indulgence. As you watch, the master begins an experiment, mixing yolk and oil together, testing ratios, searching for harmony between old and new. The result smells like both breakfast and machinery. He paints a small Madonna, half in tempera, half in oil. The difference is stunning. The tempera side glows like sunrise, the oil side like candlelight. One is heaven, the other flesh. You find yourself torn too. The tempera world feels sacred but rigid, an orchestra of precision. Oil is seductive chaos, promising freedom with every slippery stroke. You can see how this could tear workshops apart, pitting old masters against restless prodigies. A fringe anecdote drifts from a passing merchant. In Venice, some artists are already using oil over tempera to make their saints shimmer like living creatures. They say it breathes, he whispers. The paint itself breathes. You roll your eyes, but secretly, you want to see it. The apprentices debate late into the night. One argues that yolk has soul, oil has vanity. Another counters that if God made olives, he meant their oil for beauty too. You suspect they'd argue theology over mayonnaise if given the chance. The master sits apart, staring at his half-finished Madonna. When you use yolk, he finally says, you work with the paint. When you use oil, the paint works for you. The distinction lands heavily. You realize he's talking about more than art. He's talking about control, humility, the fragile balance between maker and medium. He decides to send you and another apprentice to spy, well, observe, a Flemish merchant's collection arriving in Florence. You travel through narrow streets buzzing with rumor. When you finally see the paintings, your breath catches. The faces are soft, almost breathing. Fabrics ripple with invisible wind. Even shadows have temperature. It's uncanny. You can see pores, light, time itself. Back at the workshop, you describe it to the others. Some scoff. Tricks of varnish. Others grow quiet. The master listens, then sighs. So be it, he says. Let them have their oils. We'll keep our light. He touches the yolk bowl gently, as if blessing it. You can paint flesh with oil, but only soul with tempera. Still, curiosity lingers. You notice him sneaking experiments at night, tiny test panels where yolk meets oil, pigment meets innovation. He doesn't admit it, but you can tell he's both threatened and inspired. Maybe progress always begins that way, with fear disguised as contempt. The apprentices whisper a new joke. What's the difference between oil and tempera? One asks. Oil forgives. You laugh quietly, even as you sense the melancholy beneath it. The era of yolk isn't ending overnight, but its monopoly is cracking. Historians today still debate how quickly the transition happened. Some claim tempera and oil coexisted peacefully for decades, each used for different effects. Others argue the change was swift and brutal, driven by vanity and market demand. You suspect the truth is somewhere between. Beauty rarely dies cleanly. As the master finishes his hybrid Madonna, you study her face. The tempera side glows like faith, the oil side gleams like flesh. Together, they create something new, something unsettlingly human. You realize that progress often feels like betrayal while it's happening. The night deepens. The studio smells of both egg and oil, purity and temptation. You dip a brush into each and let the colors mingle on your palette. For a moment, you feel the history between your fingertips, the end of one world, the birth of another. A candle flickers out. The master sighs, rubbing his eyes. Tomorrow, he says softly, we return to yolk. We paint the old way, one last time. You nod, though you know he doesn't mean last. He means forever and yet fading. Somewhere in the dark, a jar clinks shut. Oil waits patiently. The next morning feels like a calm after thunder, quiet, heavy, pretending nothing has changed. But everyone knows it has. The apprentices move carefully, almost reverently, around their tempera bowls, as if the yolks themselves might sense betrayal. The master has returned to his old rhythm, grinding pigments, separating eggs, muttering prayers. Yet his eyes wander now and then toward the locked cabinet where that tiny vial of oil hides. You sense a strange defiance in the air, the kind that comes when tradition digs in its heels. The workshop smells sharper today: vinegar, yolk, chalk, the acrid perfume of pride. Someone has scribbled "oil is for merchants" on the back wall in charcoal. You can't tell if it's rebellion or insecurity. And then, as if on cue, a visitor arrives, a pale young scholar from Florence, parchment tucked under his arm, ink smudged on his fingers. He bows and explains that he's writing a treatise on the moral purity of tempera. The apprentices exchange looks. The master raises an eyebrow, then gestures for him to sit. You realize you've stumbled into the birth of what you jokingly think of as the Yolk Defense League. The scholar speaks with the intensity of a preacher. Egg tempera, he declares, is the purest of mediums, untainted by greed, unspoiled by indulgence. He waves his notes dramatically. It dries fast because truth waits for no man. Oil, however, is lazy, deceitful, it hides flaws beneath gloss. You stifle a grin. He sounds like someone arguing that spinach is morally superior to chocolate cake. Still, there's conviction in his voice that moves even the tired apprentices. He calls tempera a symbol of spiritual discipline, each stroke deliberate, each line humble. To paint in tempera, he insists, is to confess one's soul. Historians still argue whether Renaissance artists truly linked morality to medium or whether this was just posturing by those unwilling to change. Either way, the rhetoric was fiery. In letters and guild meetings, painters defended the yoke as if defending scripture. The master nods thoughtfully. Yes, he says, tempera teaches restraint. You cannot overindulge. You must think before you act. Then he glances at you and adds dryly, like good conversation and bad wine. The apprentices chuckle softly. But the argument doesn't end there. A journeyman named Carlo, who once worked briefly in Venice, speaks up. I've seen what oil can do, he says. You can soften shadows. Flesh can breathe. Isn't life itself soft? Why must art stay stiff? The room stills. The scholar frowns. Because the world's softness tempts the soul to sin. Carlo shrugs. Or tempts it to feel. The master doesn't intervene. You sense he enjoys the duel. For a few moments, the studio becomes a miniature courtroom, each pigment jar a silent witness. Then, with a touch of humor, the master says, perhaps the yoke is our conscience, and oil is our desire. He smirks. If so, Florence will always have both. A wave of laughter breaks the tension, but beneath it, you feel something deeper, a recognition that art, like faith, thrives on contradiction. Later that day, the apprentices paint with renewed zeal, almost pious in their devotion. The scholar watches, scribbling notes furiously. You dip your brush into the yolk mix and feel its familiar resistance. It forces precision. There's no room for hesitation. Every line must be intentional, every highlight owned. You realize this might be the real reason some artists refuse oil. Not purity, but pride. Tempera doesn't forgive. You either master it, or it humiliates you. As the hours drift by, the master tells stories to keep morale high. F.A. Angelico, he says, never touched his brush without prayer. You picture the monk artist whispering blessings over each egg yolk, his colors luminous not from chemistry but from faith. Then the master chuckles. And yet, some say he kept a bottle of oil hidden behind the crucifix. Everyone laughs. The irony is too delicious to resist. A fringe tidbit surfaces. In certain monasteries, monks supposedly used consecrated eggs, those laid on feast days, for their paintings, believing divine yolks made divine art. You imagine a chicken blessed by holy water, clucking smugly as it lays a future saint's halo. You almost snort out loud. By dusk, the scholar departs, leaving behind his pamphlet, a stack of dense Latin paragraphs praising the chaste, sun-born medium of tempera. The apprentices take turns reading bits aloud, replacing key words with rude jokes. Chaste, one says, but sticky. The laughter echoes through the studio like incense for skeptics. Later, you find the master standing alone, examining a half-finished panel. They think it's about holiness, he says quietly. It's not. It's about control. Tempera keeps us honest. Oil makes liars of us all. You want to ask if he truly believes that, but he's already turned back to his work, dabbing tiny strokes of light along a painted robe. The glow is breathtaking, soft yet precise, holy yet human. Maybe he's right. Maybe the yolk demands honesty because it allows no second chances. Historians still debate whether this moral stance was genuine devotion or convenient marketing, a way to frame resistance as virtue. Either way, it shaped generations of painters. Some even wrote oaths promising to use yolk until my hand grows still. That night, after everyone leaves, you linger a moment longer. The leftover yolks sit in small bowls, cooling under candlelight. They look like captured suns, fading slowly into shadow. You can't help whispering to one, "You're the good kind of stubborn." A faint creak behind you. Someone's returned. It's the master, holding the vial of oil. He studies it, then sighs. Even saints need temptation, he says, and sets it down beside the yolks. For a moment, both gleam together, the ancient and the new, side by side on the same table. Then he blows out the candle, and darkness swallows them equally. The workshop wakes under a restless hush, as if everyone's afraid to move too quickly and break the spell of yesterday's convictions. You're half expecting another moral lecture about purity and yolks, but instead the master gathers everyone around the central table and says simply, "Today, we learn why it shines." He holds up a finished panel, a saint bathed in light so tender it feels alive. The gold leaf dances, but beneath it, the painted robes gleam softly, like morning dew. "See that," he murmurs. "That glow, that's not the gold. That's the yolk." You lean closer, noticing how the colors shimmer differently depending on the angle. The blues pulse like breathing fabric, the reds deepen with the flicker of every candle flame. The whole thing feels alive, though no motion stirs. You can smell faint warmth, the scent of dried egg mingled with dust. It's strangely human. The master dips his brush into a small jar of tempera, swirling gently. "The secret is in the protein," he says, almost reverently. "The yolk forms a film, a skin, that binds the pigment. When light hits it, it doesn't just reflect. It passes through, bounces back from beneath. He pauses, smiles faintly. That's why tempera never fades, it breathes light. Historians still argue whether early painters understood this science or stumbled upon it by accident. Some claim they were protochemists, aware of oxidation and refractive layers. Others insist they were guided purely by intuition and miracle. You suspect the truth, as usual, lies somewhere in the middle, equal parts genius and luck, breakfast and brilliance. The master gestures for you to mix a fresh batch. You crack an egg carefully, separating yolk from white. The membrane bursts with a soft pop, releasing a rich gold droplet into the bowl. You mix it with pigment and water, watching it thicken to the consistency of melted butter. When you brush it across the panel, you can almost feel it tightening as it dries, like skin forming over healing light. He asks one of the older apprentices to fetch a mirror. When it arrives, he holds it beside the painting. Notice, he says, how oil makes light sit on the surface, but tempera makes light live inside it. He tilts the mirror slightly. The oil-painted fragment nearby glints like glass. The tempera panel glows like sunrise through fog. Oil boasts. Yolk whispers, he murmurs. You can't resist joking, so the yolk's humble and photogenic. The master laughs softly. Exactly. A rare combination in artists. The others chuckle, but you can sense a real wonder spreading through the room. For all its humble ingredients, egg tempera defies logic. It's fragile yet eternal, opaque yet translucent. You think of it as the visual equivalent of a secret recipe, impossible to replicate without heart. He explains further, this time slipping into philosopher mode. The yolk oxidizes. It cross-links. That's what gives it strength. You nod sagely, though you barely follow. Think of it like the difference between candle wax and amber. Wax melts, amber endures. Tempera becomes amber. He steps back, lets you all stare. The saint on the panel seems to radiate her own light, soft and unwavering. You could swear she's breathing. She won't darken, he says, not for 500 years. You smirk, you probably won't survive that long. He grins. Then let her outlive me. That joke lands, and yet it carries a kind of melancholy truth. Every brushstroke here is a defiance of time, a wager against decay. One apprentice raises his hand timidly. Maestro, he asks, why does some tempera shine more than others? Mine looks dull. The master squints. Because you rush. Light rewards patience. He leans in, voice dropping. If you paint too thick, the yolk clouds. Too thin, and the pigment starves. But just enough, then the soul hums. Historians still argue whether Renaissance artists deliberately exploited these microlayers for optical effects or if modern restorers only imagine that sophistication. Either way, standing here, you can see the results. Shimmering surfaces that seem to hold trapped sunlight. A fringe rumor drifts in from another workshop. Someone claims adding a drop of honey makes the tempera sweeter to the eye. Another insists that rubbing the dried surface with a silk cloth at midnight makes it shine like the moon. You picture a group of painters polishing saints under starlight and stifle a laugh. The master rolls his eyes. If honey made art eternal, the bees would be rich. Still, you wonder if some superstition might carry truth. After all, even science starts with wonder, and superstition is just wonder in disguise. Later, he takes you to the window, holding the painted panel toward the light. The rays catch the surface and break into 1,000 gentle reflections. You see, he murmurs, light doesn't just strike, it enters, lingers, escapes again. That's the miracle. You can't help noticing how poetic he sounds when talking about chemistry. Maybe that's what great artists always do. turn science into metaphor until no one can tell the difference. As the day wears on, the apprentices test small swatches of color, adjusting ratios of yolk to pigment. You compare notes: more yolk, more gloss, less, more matte. It's like tuning an instrument made of light. You think, not for the first time, that painters might be closer to alchemists than priests. By twilight, the studio is filled with panels drying in neat rows. Each catches the fading sun in a slightly different way. Reds turn to rust, blues to silver. The entire room flickers like a field of captured sunsets. The master sighs contentedly. See how they still glow, even as the light dies? That's tempera's promise. It remembers daylight. You glance again at the saint's serene face. Her smile seems to shift, almost knowingly. Maybe that's the real secret of the yolk, not just how it shines, but how it keeps shining, long after the hands that made it are dust. Outside, the evening bells toll, and for once, you don't mind the echo of routine. You've learned something precious today, not just how yolk bonds pigment, but how devotion bonds time. You tidy up the brushes, wipe the bowls, and glance at your reflection in a water jar. The candle beside you flickers, and for a heartbeat, you swear your face gleams with that same inner light. Maybe you've been working too long, or maybe, just maybe, the yolk has finally learned your name. The rain starts before dawn, a soft tapping against the tiled roof like an impatient patron. The workshop smells of wet wood, chalk, and faintly sour yolk, yesterday's leftovers awaiting their fate. You step inside to find the apprentices clustered around the long table, not with brushes in hand but with knives. The master stands at the head, holding a thin gold sheet between his fingers. It trembles slightly, catching the gray light. You've learned how it shines, he says calmly. Now you'll learn how to make it worship. Gold. Not paint this time, leaf, impossibly thin, lighter than a whisper. It is destined to frame halos, archangels, holy light itself. But here's the secret the master lets slip with a mischievous smile. Gold alone isn't enough. It needs tempera to anchor it, egg yolk and bowl to keep heaven from peeling off. He drops the gold leaf onto the table. It floats down like a feather, so delicate it curls at the edges. You and the others hold your breath. No one wants to be the one who sneezes history away. The master explains the ritual. First comes the bowl, a soft red clay, mixed with water and a hint of yolk. It's warm to the touch, earthy and alive, like mud from some sacred river. You spread it gently across the panel, smoothing it with your thumb. It stains your skin the color of sunrise. Historians still argue whether the use of bowl beneath gold was purely practical or spiritual, whether the warm undertone made the gold gleam brighter, or whether it symbolized blood beneath divinity. You suspect it's both. Most beautiful things in history wore two faces. Once the bowl is ready, you wait. It must be just damp enough to accept the gold without smudging. The master lifts the leaf with a squirrel hair brush, a trick of static, not strength, and lays it over the surface. The gold sighs as it touches down, almost imperceptible, but enough to make every apprentice lean forward in reverence. Now, he whispers, the yolk speaks. He takes a fine brush, dips it in diluted egg yolk, and taps along the edges. It seeps into the bowl like honey through bread, binding metal to earth. A few tiny flakes lift and drift away like sunbeams set free. You find yourself holding your breath again, as if breathing too loudly might offend the saint in progress. A fringe anecdote surfaces in his storytelling as he works. Some painters, he says, used their own breath to soften the bowl before laying gold. Others claimed a whispered prayer made the leaf cling better. Maybe the saints just liked flattery, he adds dryly. You try your hand next. The gold leaf clings to your brush like a skittish cat. Your fingers tremble. The apprentices around you go quiet, the kind of silence that feels like centuries watching. You lower the leaf, and it tears, just a hairline fracture, but enough to make your stomach drop. The master doesn't scold. Instead, he gently presses a second sliver over the gap, smooths it with a breath, and says, "Gold forgives. Tempera doesn't." Everyone laughs softly, grateful for the reminder. Once the panels are gilded, the burnishing begins. You pick up a polished agate stone, curved like a river pebble, and rub the surface with slow, circular motions. At first it's dull, but then, like a curtain lifting, the gold comes alive. It doesn't just reflect light, it seems to store it, then release it in slow, rich waves. You whisper, "Magic," without meaning to. The master hears. "Not magic," he replies. "Yolk." He explains that the tempera underlayer grips the bowl cradles the gold, and the gold, well, the gold tells the story. "Light is the language of heaven," he says softly. "Yolk is just the translator." Historians still debate whether gilding was considered part of painting or a separate craft entirely. In many workshops, specialized gilders handled it, their hands trained to the tremor of a single breath. Here, though, everyone learns. Because here, tempera is not just paint, it's a worldview. The master moves to a side panel depicting an angel's robe. Instead of covering the entire thing in gold, he paints thin yolk lines and lays gold only along the edges, filigree so fine it looks spun by spiders. "This," he says, "is what makes tempera sing. Light dances where yolk invites it." As the day wears on, the room fills with golden whispers. Panels shimmer in every corner, catching the stormy daylight and turning it to warm fire. It's like sitting inside a treasure chest, but quieter, holier, somehow aware of its own weight. You pause to stretch your aching hands and glance at one of the younger apprentices, who is, quite literally, gilded up to his elbows. "You look like a saint who lost a fight with a bakery," you whisper. He snorts, sending a gold flake flying onto his nose. Another apprentice swears she heard of a painter who mixed powdered gold with egg yolk directly to paint celestial rays, a recipe so expensive patrons demanded contracts to account for every gram. "Imagine," she says, "signing receipts for sunlight. By dusk, your hands ache, your clothes sparkle faintly like someone glued a treasure map to you, and the panels look like they could blind anyone who walks in unprepared." The master inspects each carefully, running his fingertips lightly over the edges, not touching the gold directly, just sensing the bond beneath. He seems pleased. "When the yolk and gold agree," he says, "they never let go. Centuries will pass. Dust will fall. Thieves will come. The gold will still sing." And that thought hits you harder than expected. All day you've been brushing, breathing, pressing. But what you've really been doing is building something meant to outlive every one of you. The yolk is humble, the gold is proud, but together they make a promise neither could keep alone. Historians still argue why gilding fell out of favor later. Some blame oil's rise, others changing tastes. But in this moment, watching candlelight crawl across a freshly gilded halo, it's hard to imagine anything more radiant. As the rain finally quiets, the apprentices clean their tools, sweeping stray gold dust from the table into a jar, waste nothing. Those flecks might crown a saint tomorrow. You wipe your palms and notice how they still glitter faintly, as if the gold refuses to let go of you, either. The master leans against the table, tired but content. "When you paint with yolk," he says softly, "you build light. When you add gold, you build eternity." You glance at the halos glowing quietly in the darkened room. They don't flicker like candles. They don't fade like paint still wet. They simply are. You know then that even if oil takes over one day, nothing can erase this brilliance. This is the stubborn, golden heartbeat of tempera. Night again. The air smells faintly of egg, ash, and cold wax. The master has dismissed most of the apprentices, but you're asked to stay behind. Something about trust, or perhaps curiosity, hard to tell which. The candles burn low, throwing long trembling shadows across the painted panels stacked like sleeping relics. He says quietly, "You've seen the yolk's light. Now you'll see its secrets." You follow him through a narrow hallway lined with locked cupboards and shelves heavy with jars. Some are labeled in neat Latin script, Terra Rossa, Ultramarine, Lapis Lazuli. Others bear only cryptic symbols. He takes out a small brass key and unlocks the last cabinet. Inside, wrapped in linen, lie thin notebooks. You glimpse sketches, color swatches, and faint writing. He taps the top one. "The true treasure of the workshop," he says. "Not gold, not pigment, knowledge." You hesitate before asking, "Is that your recipe book?" He smiles. "Mine, and others before me." He opens to a random page. The handwriting changes every few lines, a chorus of voices whispering through centuries. One entry reads, "For blues that never fade, mix yolk with vinegar and a breath of oil." Another, "To temper vermilion, stir thrice counterclockwise while humming Ave Maria." You stifle a laugh, and he raises a finger. "Mock later. Copy now." You begin to realize how seriously these painters guarded their egg secrets. This wasn't mere craft, it was alchemy, and every recipe was a spell. Historians still argue whether these formulae were superstition, coded chemistry, or both. Maybe they were all of it at once, Renaissance multitasking. He hands you a new notebook, blank except for your name on the first page. "Every artist must write their own gospel," he says. "The yolk forgives no imitators." You sit at a small desk while he continues sorting his notes. The room is quiet except for the faint scratching of your pen. You can almost hear the ghosts of past painters muttering behind you. Botticelli, perhaps, grumbling about proportions. Or maybe F.A. Angelico, too saintly to complain but smug about his glazing technique. When you ask if he ever shared these recipes, the master laughs softly. "Once, I told a patron the wrong ratio of yolk to pigment, accidentally, of course." His apprentices spent months wondering why their saints looked seasick. You grin. "So, you sabotaged them?" He shrugs. "I protected the lineage." That's when it hits you. These men and women weren't just painting for glory or money. They were curators of invisible legacies. Egg tempera wasn't just a method. It was identity, pride, even a touch of rebellion. The master begins telling stories in that sleepy, firelit tone teachers use when they forget they are teaching. Leonardo, he says, experimented endlessly with egg mixtures before turning to oil. His notebooks full of half-mad marginalia about drying times, humidity, and whether yolk could imitate the tenderness of flesh. Historians still argue whether he ever perfected it. The surviving tests look more like forensic experiments than art. Then there's Botticelli, whose Primavera and Birth of Venus pulse with tempera's luminous calm. He understood yolk like a poet understands silence. The master murmurs. Every thin layer, a heartbeat. Botticelli mixed his pigments so finely they behaved almost like oil, yet without surrendering to its gloss. And F.A. Angelico, quiet, devoted, the monk painter who reportedly prayed before every brushstroke. His tempera work glows as if blessed from within. One rumor claims he mixed holy water with his yolk. Another, that his tears improved the shine. You can't decide which sounds more implausible, or more touching. You picture each of them hunched over their panels, hoarding yolks like dragon gold. Leonardo obsessing over microstructure, Botticelli chasing grace, Efore Angelico whispering prayers to drying paint. The room seems to shimmer faintly with their ghosts. The master closes the cabinet and locks it again. They guarded their formulas not out of greed, he says, but out of fear. Knowledge was fragile. One fire, one plague, one jealous rival, and a century of discovery could vanish. He pauses. It's easier to lose a notebook than a painting. That line settles over you like dust. You think of all the lost recipes, the shades that once existed but no longer can because someone forgot to write down how much yolk went into the mix. A fringe rumor he mentions makes you smile. One forgotten Venetian painter supposedly encrypted his recipe by painting it into a fresco, each saint's robe color corresponding to an ingredient. To decode it, you'd have to read the whole church like a cookbook. Historians still argue whether it's true, the master says with a grin. But I rather like the idea of holy pigment espionage. The candles burn lower. You write down what you remember from the day's lesson. The ratio of yolk to pigment, the humidity ideal for drying, the strange harmony of breath and light. You add your own small notes too. Smells like sunrise. Feels like patience. Reminds me that time can be kind. The master peers over your shoulder, reading your scrawl. You're learning, he says softly. Not just the how, but the why. You smile faintly. Still feels like cooking. He chuckles. Every masterpiece begins in a kitchen. Don't tell the patrons. He pours 2 small cups of watered wine, standard workshop ration, and raises one toward you. To the yolk, he says solemnly. And to everyone foolish enough to chase its light. You clink cups. The warmth spreads slowly, like fresh paint drying into permanence. You imagine generations of painters doing exactly this, drinking, arguing, whispering secrets over candlelight. They must have known their world was changing, that oil was coming, that the age of yolk would someday dim. But for now, here in this small pool of golden light, it still reigns supreme. When you leave the studio that night, you glance back through the doorway. The locked cabinet gleams faintly under candlelight. Inside it sleeps the lineage of centuries, recipes, failures, triumphs, all written in a language of patience and egg. You wonder if your notes will ever join them, if someone centuries from now will read your scribbles and laugh at your handwriting but still try your mixtures. The thought feels strangely comforting. Art is memory disguised as color, after all, and tonight, memory smells faintly of yolk. Morning arrives with a rumble of wagon wheels outside the studio. Merchants again, their carts laden with clinking jars and burlap sacks of precious, powdered dreams. You can smell the spice of crushed minerals before you even see them. The master beckons you to the doorway. Come, he says, time to see how far one yolk can travel. You follow him into the narrow streets of Florence, where voices bounce off stone walls like echoes in a canyon. Every stall seems to hold something miraculous or mildly toxic. A boy is grinding cinnabar with a mortar, his hands stained a dangerous pink. A merchant unrolls silk pouches of azurite and malachite, each shade more impossible than the last. Lapis from Afghanistan, he says proudly, worth more than gold. And you realize, without these traders, half the Renaissance palette wouldn't exist. The yolk binds the color, yes, but these men and women carry it across deserts and seas. The eggs might come from local farms, but the blues, the greens, the shimmering reds, they are born halfway across the world. Historians still argue whether the pigment trade shaped art more than the artists themselves. Did genius bloom from imagination, or simply from what arrived in those dusty sacks? You glance at a merchant's ledger, weights, coins, obscure markings, and it's hard not to think that the Renaissance was built as much on math as on magic. The master haggles gracefully, waving away an outrageous offer for vermilion. He knows the true value of yolk, not as commodity but as power. Without the egg, he murmurs to you, these colors die in their jars. It's the yolk that sets them free. The merchant laughs. Then you'd better buy more hens. You follow him to another stall, where an older woman sells dried egg powder, a travel version for painters on the road. She swears it works just as well once mixed with water, though the master scoffs. Instant art, he mutters. What's next? Saints by the dozen. The woman isn't offended. Suit yourself, she says. But when winter comes and the hens stop laying, you'll come back. You make a mental note. Even the best alchemists need backups. Back at the workshop, the apprentices unpack the loot. Lapis lazuli, ground from stone that once lay hidden in Afghan cliffs, glitters like crushed sky. It's destined for the virgin's robes, each gram mixed with egg yolk to make blue so pure it could shame a summer noon. The master handles it like sacred relics, counting grains. You can't resist whispering, do we measure paint by prayer or by weight today? Both, he replies. One for the patrons, one for the saints. A quirky rumor surfaces as you work. Supposedly, some Venetian merchants smuggled ultramarine in hollowed-out loaves of bread to avoid taxes. Another tale insists smugglers disguised powdered pigment as spice, fooling customs officers with a sneeze and a wink. Historians still argue whether any of that's true, the master says with a grin, but if it isn't, it should be. You think of the yolk again, the humble center of all this extravagance. Across the world, ships risk storms, camels trudge through sand, and men count coins just so you can dip a brush into a golden blob and make color breathe. Somehow, that feels cosmic and ridiculous at the same time. The apprentices chatter about prices. A single egg costs 1 copper, one says. But a handful of lapis is 30 florins. Another adds, and we mix them like equals. You smile. Guess the yolk negotiates well. They laugh, but it's true. The egg levels the playing field. It makes the raw affordable, the fragile durable. It's the bridge between kitchen and cathedral. You picture some medieval painter decades ago, hunched over an altarpiece, breaking an egg into a bowl and whispering, "This is enough." Later, you help the master stretch a canvas for a merchant's commission, a secular one, which feels oddly modern. No saints, just a portrait of a prosperous banker and his unsmiling wife. He wants lapis for her gown, of course, and a gilded border to suggest divine favor, but discreetly. The master rolls his eyes but agrees. As you grind pigments, he explains how supply affects art itself. When blue costs more than gold, painters use it sparingly. The Virgin's robe, always blue, because patrons could see the price of devotion. You stir yolk into pigment, and the paint thickens, luscious and luminous. It feels almost alive, eager. We talk about genius, he says, but half of it is logistics. You can't invent a new color if no one brings you the rock. Historians still debate how much art owes to commerce, whether inspiration or trade routes shaped the Renaissance more. But right now, standing among sacks of rare earth and baskets of fresh eggs, you realize they were never separate. Outside, another caravan arrives from Venice, carrying glass jars, resins, and tiny parchment packets labeled in Greek. The merchants exchange news with your master: wars, famines, floods that delay shipments. Even saints must wait for good weather, one jokes. That night, as the apprentices tidy up, you notice the master sealing a letter with a wax stamp. Another pigment order, you ask. He nods. To bruise. I've heard rumors of a new yellow, brighter than orpiment, safer than lead. He smirks. And guess what it binds best with? You answer automatically. Yolk. Exactly. He sets the letter aside and adds, almost wistfully, the yolk is the heart of trade, too. It's light enough to carry anywhere, steady enough to outlast the voyage. In some places, they even use it as currency, 1 egg for a bowl of ochre, 2 for a prayer. A fringe detail catches your imagination. Sailors, he says, sometimes coated pigment bundles with dried egg mixture to preserve them during humid crossings. Smelled terrible when they arrived, he admits, but the color survived. By the time you clean your brushes, the workshop feels more like a shipping hub than a sacred studio. Jars are labeled, sealed, packed, some bound for Rome, others for Milan. And in each crate lies a little bowl, covered in linen, with the faint golden sheen of dried yolk at its center. The master pats one of the crates affectionately. Every journey begins with a breakfast, he says. You roll your eyes, but he isn't wrong. You step outside into the cooling evening. Somewhere beyond the city walls, caravans move under the stars, carrying the hues of heaven and the yolks of earth, trading one miracle for another. You think of the absurd symmetry, men risking lives so someone else can paint angels' wings. And yet, without them, the world would be gray. As you watch the wagons vanish into twilight, you can't help smiling. Somewhere out there, another apprentice is cracking an egg, wondering if this one will be the one that changes everything. The years slip forward quietly, like paint drying under a thin glaze. The studio you once knew hums with new apprentices, new patrons, new demands. But time, like tempera, has a way of hardening. The yolk that once made miracles now becomes mystery. You walk the echoing halls of a modern museum instead of a candlelit workshop, and the air smells not of eggs but of solvents and ozone. Here, the paintings of your long-gone masters hang beneath perfect, humming lights. You stand before one, Botticelli, perhaps, and notice the same thing your old teacher once pointed out. Light that doesn't just sit on the surface, but glows from within. The colors haven't dimmed, not really. 500 years, and they still breathe. But you also see tiny cracks, crackly like a spider web, delicate as veins under skin. Beauty aging gracefully. A conservator works nearby, gloved hands steady, voice low. We call this the egg's revenge, she jokes, as she applies a minute brushstroke of consolidant along a flaking edge. You smile, though you don't fully understand. She explains that tempera's strength is also its cause. The yolk binds pigment tightly but grows brittle over centuries. It resists humidity, mocks dust, but when the world shifts around it, wood warps, climates change, it cracks. The perfect paradox, an art so durable it can die from its own perfection. Historians still argue whether the old masters foresaw this. Some say they knew tempera was mortal, that its brilliance was meant to last a lifetime, not eternity. Others claim they trusted divine intervention to preserve it. You suspect neither, they just trusted the yolk, because it had never failed them before. The conservator moves closer to another panel, St. Jerome in his study, perhaps, and peers through a microscope. The proteins, she murmurs, they've cross-linked in ways we still can't predict. She sounds almost reverent. Every egg behaves differently. Sometimes it yellows, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it darkens the blue. It's alive, in its way. That catches you. Alive. You imagine millions of microscopic bonds, the same organic molecules that once nourished a chick now clinging to pigment, refusing to fade. A forgotten pulse in every layer. There's something almost eerie about it. The same stuff that could have become breakfast, or life, chose instead to become color. And centuries later, it still resists decay. You whisper, so they didn't just paint with yolk. They painted with time. The conservator smiles. Exactly. Time, trapped in protein. You wander further into the museum, where a display case holds cracked palettes, old brushes, even fragments of eggshells excavated from workshop ruins. It feels almost sacred, like relics of saints. A small placard reads, "Evidence of egg tempera discovered in restoration dust." You laugh softly. Restoration dust sounds like poetry disguised as chemistry. In another room, a digital screen plays footage of scientists analyzing fragments under infrared light. You watch as spectral images reveal brushstrokes buried beneath the visible layer, ghosts of the artist's hand. And sometimes, faint traces of yolk residue glimmer under UV. Proof, the caption says, of organic binding agents, egg-based tempera confirmed. Historians still debate why some regions clung to tempera long after oil took over. In places like Florence, the discipline itself was identity, a kind of vow. Egg paint wasn't just medium, it was devotion made visible. Maybe that's why, even now, restorers treat each yolk layer like a heartbeat. You step closer to a cracked panel, its edges flaking like pastry, and think about all those apprentices who spilled yolk, who cursed their ratios, who never dreamed someone centuries later would examine their mistakes under magnification. You can almost hear them laughing from the past. "You still studying our breakfast?" A quirky detail on one exhibit placard catches your attention. Traces of garlic and fig sap were detected alongside egg proteins. Garlic? The note explains that some artists added it to deter insects. Apparently, it adds wryly, "It worked." You grin. Renaissance pest control, nothing but the best. In another display, a preserved panel shows an unfinished angel. The yolk mix has oxidized unevenly, creating a faint golden halo where none was painted. The egg outsmarted the artist, the conservator says nearby. We call it serendipitous luminosity. Historians still argue whether such effects were accidents or early attempts at light manipulation. Either way, the results are haunting. As the day fades, the museum empties. You linger, alone with centuries of silence and softly glowing saints. The lights dim automatically, and for a moment, the panels seem to shimmer in their own private dawn. The yolk hasn't died, it's just sleeping. You think back to your master's words, "When the yolk and gold agree, they never let go." He was right. Even when paint cracks and pigment fades, something invisible remains, the bond itself, stubborn and golden. You picture conservators hundreds of years from now, peering through microscopes more advanced than imagination, still chasing the secret that every Renaissance apprentice already knew: patience, precision, reverence, and a good egg. The thought makes you chuckle, a quiet sound swallowed by the museum's echoing halls. There's something comforting in knowing that even after all the science, all the analysis, the heart of it hasn't changed. Someone still cracks an egg to make something beautiful. As you leave, you glance back one last time. The panels shimmer faintly in the distance, their light soft, patient, eternal. Maybe the egg's revenge isn't decay at all, but endurance. You wake to the faint buzz of fluorescent lights instead of candle flames, the tang of disinfectant instead of drying yolk. You're no longer an apprentice but a visitor in a modern conservation lab, where men and women in white coats have replaced the dusty smocks of the Renaissance. The air hums with quiet machinery, a chorus of steady beeps and clicking microscopes. You slip in quietly, half expecting the master to scold you for being late, but here the masters wear nitrile gloves and speak Latin only to the chemicals. On the counter before you, a petri dish gleams with what looks like a drop of liquid gold. It's not paint, it's reconstituted yolk. A conservator stares it gently with a pipette. "We're trying to reverse engineer the old recipes," she explains. "Same ratios, same minerals, same madness." She grins, and you feel instantly at home. Some things never change, especially the madness. You watch as she mixes finely ground azurite into the yolk, drop by drop, the color deepening into a blue that feels alive again. Under the microscope, the particles swirl and settle like galaxies. The proteins still do their dance, she murmurs. 500 years, and they behave the same way. You just have to coax them. Historians still argue whether modern chemistry can truly replicate the Renaissance palette. Some say the original eggs were richer, fed on wild herbs and insects. Others claim it's the ancient atmosphere itself, the slow-drying air of stone studios, that gave the paint its soul. You lean closer to the microscope, and it's hard not to believe the latter. Nearby, another researcher points to a glowing monitor showing color maps of a restored FRA Angelico panel. Look, she says. This is why yolk still wins. The microfilm it forms scatters light differently, so the colors seem to glow, even under lead. You tilt your head. So, egg paint still beats the 21st century. She laughs. Every time. Try finding a polymer that ages this gracefully. You walk through the lab, marveling at the mix of technology and reverence. UV scanners trace cracks invisible to the naked eye. 3D printers replicate missing fragments of old panels. But at the center of it all, humble, golden, indestructible, sits the yolk. There's something oddly moving about it. The same stuff that once lived in baskets under kitchen tables now fuels million-dollar research. You remember grinding pigment until your wrists ached, the smell of sulfur and straw, the way the yolk tightened under your brush. These scientists might have traded aprons for lab coats, but you can tell, they love it just as fiercely. One of them beckons you toward a modern canvas. We're testing new tempera formulations, he says. Painters today want the texture back. The control. Oil's too slick, acrylic's too forgiving. Tempera fights you, but rewards you. He hands you a brush, and you dip it into the freshly mixed yolk paint. It feels instantly familiar, smooth yet stubborn, quick to dry but easy to coax if you move with patience. As you drag it across the surface, the color binds instantly, almost breathing. You laugh quietly. Still temperamental, you say. Exactly, the scientist replies. That's why artists are returning to it. There's honesty in the struggle. You look around and realize you're surrounded by modern disciples of an ancient art. Painters, chemists, historians, they all hover at the altar of the egg. Some debate whether a drop of vinegar improves stability. Others argue over pH values or drying humidity. It's the same energy as the old workshops, just with fancier toys and fewer chickens. A fringe story makes the rounds during their coffee break. One avant-garde painter supposedly tried using vegan egg substitutes to make sustainable tempera. The result, someone says, smelled like despair and peeled in a week. You all laugh, the sound echoing off the sterile walls. Art may evolve, but some shortcuts are still doomed. Later, a conservator invites you to watch a live restoration under a microscope feed. The screen shows a centuries-old crack being gently filled with microtempera, layer by layer, almost like breathing life back into a fossil. See, she says softly, we don't paint over. We collaborate. You find that phrase perfect. Collaboration across time. The Renaissance hand and the modern hand, both guided by the same quiet devotion to light. Historians still argue whether tempera ever truly died. After all, even during oil's dominance, monasteries kept the yolk alive in icons and manuscripts. But what's clear now, standing in this humming lab, is that it never stopped being relevant. It simply rested until the world caught up. One researcher turns to you, holding a tiny glass vial. Inside swirls a suspension of nanoscopic egg proteins, tested as a sustainable binder for modern pigments. We might soon use yolk to protect digital prints, she says. Imagine a Renaissance protein preserving 21st century pixels. You blink. That's poetic. She nods. Everything old becomes technology eventually. As the day winds down, you step outside the lab. The sun is setting, and its light spills across the white walls, turning them faintly golden. You can't help but laugh softly. Even nature seems to favor tempera lighting. You remember your old master saying that the yolk remembers daylight. Now, centuries later, you realize he wasn't just speaking metaphorically. The science backs him up. The molecular structure literally traps light, diffusing it slowly over time. You whisper, "You sly old man," and half expect to hear his chuckle in return. The last technician flicks off the lights, and the room fades to shadows. But the panels under restoration seem to glow faintly in the dark, residue luminescence, they'd call it. You prefer to think it's the yolk's way of saying thank you. As you walk into the cooling evening, you pass a modern gallery where a young artist's work catches your eye. The placard reads "Egg tempera on recycled wood." Her piece glows softly, patient and alive. You watch her brushstroke shimmer under the lights, and suddenly the centuries between you and the Renaissance collapse. The yolk has bridged them, smooth, golden, eternal. You smile, whispering to yourself, "Guess we're still hoarding egg yolks." And why not? Light, after all, still needs something to call home. The studio around you quiets to a golden hush. The air feels dense with centuries, egg-scented ghosts, pigment dust, and faint echoes of brushes whispering across gesso. You stand once more before a panel half-painted, half-remembered, the last yolk sitting in its small porcelain cup like a coin of sunlight waiting to be spent. You dip the brush one final time. The yolk clings, warm and viscous, trailing behind the bristles as if reluctant to let go. You spread it thinly across a patch of unfinished sky, and it shines, faintly iridescent, even in this fading light. That glow, the one every painter chased, the one every scientist tried to explain, belongs to you for a moment. You glance up at the wall of completed works around you. Centuries of devotion glimmer quietly, their colors still sharp, their saints still patient. Each panel holds a small heartbeat of egg, a biological pulse disguised as paint. You realize it now. The Renaissance artist didn't just hoard yolks out of habit or thrift. They hoarded them because they understood something elemental. That life itself, suspended in golden liquid, could be borrowed to make beauty endure. Historians still argue whether they knew the science. Did they sense the cross-linking proteins, the controlled oxidation, the alchemy of amino acids bonding with pigment? Or did they simply trust what they saw, the way yolk kept color luminous while everything else dulled? Maybe that's why it worked so perfectly. Faith first, chemistry later. You recall a story, a fringe tale about an Italian nun painter who once mixed her yolk with a drop of rose water to sweeten the Virgin's blush. Her panels, they say, still smell faintly floral when restored. Science has yet to confirm it, but restorers swear they've caught the scent. You smile, you want to believe it. Outside, a soft drizzle begins, and the air cools. You hear the faint ticking of raindrops on the roof tiles, like brushes tapping against jars. The scent reminds you of wet plaster and drying tempera, that perfect balance between earth and egg. You think, maybe that's what the Renaissance really was, a balance. Between heaven and hands, between miracle and material. You set your brush down. The last stroke is done. The yolk dries almost instantly, locking color into place like a secret promise. You lean back and breathe. There's peace in the silence. And then, gently, you remember the others, the ones who came before. Leonardo experimenting with mixtures that cracked. Botticelli chasing light that no one else could tame. Fra Angelico painting prayer into pigment. Even the nameless apprentices who scrubbed, mixed, and cursed under their breath while keeping the tradition alive. Every one of them, bound by the same golden thread. You walk through the corridor lined with finished panels. The saints and angels look down, serene and knowing. You think of the egg again, the symbol of life, rebirth, the eternal loop of creation. Maybe the yolk wasn't just practical. Maybe it was spiritual, a way to fold life itself into paint so that even death couldn't dull the shine. The thought comforts you. The world changes, empires rise, pigments fade, and yet, across 500 years, the yolk remains faithful. You can almost hear it whisper, "I was never just breakfast." You take a last look at your work. The sky you've painted glows softly, as if lit from beneath. That's the magic. The yolk catches the light, bends it, holds it like memory. It's science and prayer, chemistry and poetry, all in one glossy film. You clean your brush with deliberate slowness. The last of the yolk swirls away into the water, forming faint golden ripples that shimmer before vanishing. You watch them dissolve and think, everything beautiful ends this way, fading not into nothing, but into everything else. Outside, thunder murmurs. You draw your shawl closer and glance once more at the panel drying under the dim lantern. The color deepens even as it sets, alive and breathing. You smile, knowing that someone centuries from now will stand before it, wondering how such light survived. And when they ask, why Renaissance artists hoarded egg yolks, you hope they'll understand it wasn't obsession or superstition. It was reverence. It was the quiet conviction that something as humble as an egg could outlast kings and cathedrals. That life, in its simplest form, could guard beauty for eternity. You step away, your hands still faintly sticky, your heart unexpectedly light. The yolk's glow seems to follow you out the door, gilding the rain, turning each droplet into a fragment of the same golden secret. The last drop of gold, resting now in that cup, reflects your own face as you leave. You think, maybe we never stop painting, we just change the walls. The lights grow softer now. The room around you blurs until all that remains is warmth, a faint scent of old paint, and the whisper of color settling into silence. The brush strokes fade, the panels melt into shadow, and the golden thread that's run through every story begins to unwind gently through the dark. You breathe slowly, the way you did back in the workshop. In through your nose, the smell of yolk and earth. Out through your mouth, the hum of centuries exhaling. The world outside quiets, like someone turned down its volume just for you. Somewhere far away, the yolk still glows beneath varnish, patient and alive. The artists who trusted it are long gone, but their light continues, humming softly through the pigment. You realize you've been part of that chain all along. The same curiosity, the same need to understand, the same love for the strange things that make beauty last. The rain outside steadies into a lullaby. The darkness folds itself neatly around you, gentle and complete. You imagine a candle's flame catching the edge of a drying panel one last time, that perfect shimmer before the night takes over. The yolk's gold becomes the moon's gold, then the gold behind your closed eyes. Everything connects, life to art, breath to color, past to present. And somewhere, in that slow, golden silence, you finally rest.